Libya's renegade general says his troops have liberated Benghazi. Has Khalifa Haftar made the city safe from militant groups, or is this his attempt at a power grab? I'm Muamar Gadhafi, and today's newsmaker is Khalifa Haftar. After 3 years of fighting, Khalifa Haftar says his forces are now in control of Libya's second biggest city, Benghazi. His enemies, several rival militant groups, including Daesh. The announcement of their defeat sparked street celebrations. The operation was aimed at stopping a wave of bombings and assassinations that targeted more than 150 police officers, lawyers, and members of civil society. But Haftar is not without his critics. Many say he created an unnecessary war for the sake of consolidating power. And they point to the optics of his victory speech, as the one-time commander in Muamar Gadhafi's army was dressed in a white military uniform, harkening back to the late dictator himself. In a moment, our panel will debate whether Haftar is the hero he makes himself out to be. But first, here's this report by Shoaib Hassan.
A time for celebration after his biggest victory yet. Khalifa Haftar has been pushing for the title of Libya's strongman till now.
وتعلن انتصار جيشك الوطني في معركة الكرامة ضد الإرهاب. نصرا مؤزرا من عند الله عز وجل. لتدخل بنغازي ابتداء من اليوم عهدا جديدا من الأمن والسلام.
That's how Haftar has consistently sold himself to the rest of the world, as a bulwark against what he says are radical Islamic militants. It was a coalition of such groups called the Benghazi Defense Brigades, with links to Daesh and Al-Qaeda, that had been in control of the city for 3 years. Haftar's Libyan National Army, or LNA, finally managed to push them out of the city this week. That's happened a few weeks after the self-styled Field Marshal and his main rival, the UN-recognized GNA based in Tripoli, met for preliminary peace talks in Abu Dhabi.
Honestly, I consider it a step in the right direction, given that Libya has reached a dead end in the dialogue and the crisis has deepened. I believe that this step from the General Khalifa Haftar is a step in the right direction, and hopefully he will stick to certain national demands that all Libyans will agree on.
Primary among those concerns is the end of fighting around facilities and ports in the southwest. Those ports are crucial for Libya's oil-based economy, and that's where Haftar has made the biggest impact. It didn't look so good at the start of the year for the Field Marshal's LNA, after it lost control of the main oil facilities to the Benghazi brigades in March. But since then, Haftar has made a sweeping comeback, retaking control of the Libyan oil crescent and capturing Benghazi and effectively demolishing the brigades as a major power. That means he now controls more territory in the country than all other groups combined, and the morale among his forces is sky high.
We attacked around half an hour ago. We have many fallen and wounded soldiers. We are the special forces, and we've known exactly when terrorism began. It wasn't recently, it was since 1989. Daesh knows us well, terrorists know us well, and we continue to bear the responsibility because of these martyrs. May God rest their souls in peace.
The UN-backed GNA in Tripoli may still claim to enjoy international legitimacy, but is it Haftar who holds the keys to the solution of the Libyan conflict? Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Mohammed Al-Jahr in Brussels. He's the founder and director of the Libya Outlook Research and Consultancy Group. From San Antonio, Mansour Al-Khikhia, he's the chairman of the Political Science Department at the University of Texas. And from Cambridge in England, Rhiannon Smith. She's the managing director of a news portal called Eye on ISIS in Libya. Thanks all of you for joining us. Mansour, let's begin with you. The last time I spoke with you, you told me you didn't like Khalifa Haftar. But don't you have to give credit where it's due now? He smashed the extremists in Benghazi and liberated the city. Isn't that a good thing?
No, I didn't tell, last time I didn't tell you I didn't like Khalifa Haftar, and to be very clear. I appreciate what he has done. Believe me, I do. After seeing what ISIS did in Benghazi, I appreciate that. But I have a fear. My fear is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what I'm seeing lately coming up of it from his spokesperson is that we give you 5 months or 6 months to get things straight, and if you don't, we will come in. And this doesn't make any sense to me, because we're still in a war. I mean, ISIS might physically have gone out of Libya, but really it's still there. The culture is still there. The big problem for me is what ISIS has left in Libya. And this is what we have to be aware of. Haftar is wrong to be saying, you have 6 months, but if you don't take care of things, I will come in and take care of things for you. I appreciate what he has done, but I'd not authorize him to replace one military regime with another.
Yeah, okay, good point. Mohammed?
This is where
so let's ask Mohammed. Yeah, so Haftar might have done a good thing by destroying ISIS, but Libyans have to be careful because this guy seems to be having the markings of a potential dictator. You would agree with that, right?
The point that needs to be made here is the fact that Khalifa Haftar enjoys a lot of popular support for what he has done. He enjoys tribal support in eastern Libya, popular support in eastern Libya, and there are more tribes, more cities and towns warming up to the idea of the military coming in to help alleviate the miserable conditions that some of the local communities across Libya are going through. And that is what needs to be focused on, to be honest. There are obviously fears by critics of Haftar, by opponents of Haftar, that he is trying to establish a new dictatorship in Libya. But the worrying part for me is that he is possibly going to establish or try to establish a dictatorship in Libya or an authoritarian regime, but with the support of the population, or at least with the support of the majority of the population. And the reason that he enjoys so much support is because of two things. First, the failure of the international community to have a post-intervention strategy after the 2011 ouster of the Gaddafi regime, but also the failure of Libyan political groups and Libyan political leaders to have an order that can actually respond to the aspirations and to the needs of people. And that is what makes Khalifa Haftar, for many people in Libya, many tribes, towns and cities, as the only viable option on the ground that can actually deliver at least on their most basic needs of stability and security.
That's interesting.
And that's very important to keep in mind.
Okay, so we're keeping it in mind. Rhiannon, does that ring true that the people might want an authoritarian leader such as Haftar? My question to you, Rhiannon, is how is this any different to the rise of Muamar Gadhafi when he enjoyed so much support amongst the Libyans?
Well, yes, I think that is a good point. So, I mean, Mohammed is right that Haftar does have, increasing amounts of support in the east and in Benghazi, particularly, he has been able to reintroduce a certain amount of security and stability. But I think, first of all, it's important to note that that support is still mainly centred in the east of Libya and not in the west or in the south. The other point, as you mentioned, this kind of authoritarianism, I think there is a danger that there becomes a kind of nostalgia for the kind of, strong man who can defeat terrorist groups, jihadis, and can bring some sense of security back. However, I don't think that that is going to work. So I think we have to remember that with the threats they've been facing from terrorism, from jihadi groups, these are only a symptom of Libya's problems. They are not the cause. And actually the cause is generally instability, but also a lack of governance and a lack of political unity. And I think these are more important. And actually, if you have Haftar coming in as a dictator or a authoritarian, then these problems will just continue and will be propagated, as we saw under Gaddafi, and will not actually get to the root of, the main reasons, the goals, the aspirations which Libyans took to the streets to revolt against in 2011.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the end, Gaddafi was killed by his own people in the most horrific of ways in a revolution. Mansour, let me ask you, the French foreign minister, the new French foreign minister, basically said Libya is a failed state and that there has to be political space for someone like Haftar. Clearly, the Tripoli-based government, the UN-backed government, would be freaking out at that statement because it delegitimizes them in some way. Do you believe that the French foreign minister is right, that there has to be space for Haftar?
Yes, of course, I do believe. And I think the Tripoli government is illegitimate in the first place. I think that our biggest problem in Libya is too much UN interference and forcing upon Libyans a legitimate government. But just to carry on, I think, with the issue of Haftar, Haftar knows better. He knows better. He has lived in exile. Whatever you want to say, he's part of the Gaddafi regime. Many were part of the Gaddafi regime. But Haftar lived in exile for close to 20 years outside, and he knows better. He knows what a democratic system is like, and he knows what he has to do. I mean, ultimately, I'm not saying there should not be a state of emergency in the country to deal with so many of these issues, but there needs to be a state of emergency under rule of law, under control, under a democratic structure. And it seems to me that if you eliminate the remaining democratic structure within the country and you put in the army, then you have a military regime. And I agree with the specialists in the Cambridge. I mean, the problem is really very deep in Libya. The problem is not in our stars, but as the Bard said, in ourselves. You know, please, just give me 1 second. When God asked Muhammad to carry the message, He didn't select him because of his beauty, because of his wealth, because of his prowess, because of his machismo. He told him, which means that we selected you because you have manners. What has happened in Libya today is they're way beyond Haftar. The problem is they've lost manners. 50 years of anarchy, 50 years of nonsense has not left the country. And Haftar cannot deal with that, not within the military regime either. Right. And so this is what he has to do. He knows better. He knows exactly what he has to do, and yet he doesn't want to do it. This is why I'm saying the French Prime Minister is quite right.
So hold on, Mansour.
That Haftar has to play a role in this.
So hold on, Mansour. Yes. When you say he knows better,
go ahead, please.
What I'm presuming is that you're saying the man, now that he's got the east of the country, he's got Benghazi, he's got the east of the country, eventually he's going to go and march on Tripoli, and it's going to be very ugly, and you're going to have east versus west. Is that what you're saying he's going to do?
Yes.
And he should know better because that will plunge the country into further civil war?
Well, he is going to go west. There's no doubt about that. He's just waiting for the opportunity to go west. The problem, he might not have lots of support in the west, but the issue is that the west is so anarchic, and we have run by militias. The east, there's a lot of sense of stability in the east, and thanks to Haftar for that. I mean, if Haftar had not intervened, rather the east would be under ISIS. And so for that, we're thankful for him. But in the west, you still have rampant militias doing what they want to do. The government in the west is quite effete. It can't do much. It can't even control Tripoli right now. Right. I mean, there's an army surrounding Tripoli that wants to remove the... And so ultimately, he's going to go. Okay. I have no doubt
so then,
him going to go.
Okay, then let me ask Mohammed.
He needs to go. He needs to know better how to do it.
Okay, so how to do it.
Go ahead, please.
Mohammed, is it going to be a mistake for Haftar to take his army and head west and try and topple the government in Tripoli?
I don't think he will want to topple the government. He knows his lines, I believe, and he knows that there are red lines for the international community when it comes to Tripoli and also when it comes to the government there. I think in the past he tried to communicate to the international community that he wanted to control Tripoli and he wanted to enter Tripoli militarily, and the answer was negative from the international community that they will not allow that and that there will be consequences for that. However, I think Haftar will be heading west, not with weapons according to his spokesperson, but also according to him. He will be going on a charm offensive and a campaign of, if you like, of outreach to local communities that have been suffering of the militias that have been roaming free in the country. For example, I'll give you one example. In El-Garabulli, around 50 kilometers east of Tripoli, civilians were killed a few days ago, and there was intense fighting because of armed groups from Misrata and armed groups from the capital Tripoli that are loyal to the government of National Accord. And do you know what the mayor of the municipality or the city of El-Garabulli was actually calling for Khalifa Haftar to come and save them and save the people. So Khalifa Haftar will be able to enter the west of Libya by capitalizing on the failures in the west of Libya and on the insecurity in the west of Libya. So if anyone wants to prevent Khalifa Haftar from coming to the west, they need to provide an alternative. They need to show that there is an alternative that can actually work on the ground.
Okay.
Otherwise, he will definitely be in the west of Libya and possibly fairly soon.
Sure. But what Mr. Sarraj and his government are saying, we have a government, give us a chance. Why are you already putting your support? I mean, they're thinking, why is the UAE, why is Egypt, why are these countries putting their support behind a strong man? Because he's not an Islamist, so he must be a good guy. but they're putting their support behind him instead of them, who are the UN-sanctioned government. You have to understand their perspective as well, right? They're not even being given the chance to govern.
Yes. Yeah, they have been given 2 years. Their mandate is almost over. So the mandate of the Government of National Accord and Prime Minister Sarraj actually runs out on the 17th of December of this year. So they have had almost 2 years to try and get something done. Khalifa Haftar succeeded where others have failed. He managed to win the support of the local communities, and he managed to get the support of key regional players and also European countries, including France and other countries. So he managed to play his game domestically and also regionally and internationally right. He had a plan. He implemented that plan on the ground, and that is what has been lacking in Libya over the last 6 years. No one had a plan, and no one was willing to implement a plan on the ground. And Khalifa Haftar is the result of failure in Libya. Khalifa Haftar came as a result of failure of the international community and failure of successive Libyan governments and Libyan political groups to come up with a solution to the problems that the country has been facing for the last 6 years.
Understood.
So that is why Khalifa Haftar is getting stronger. That is why Khalifa Haftar has a reliability and credibility in the eyes of people and regional players and backers.
Okay, so Rhiannon, he's the result of failure, but is he the answer to the problems that have emerged due to that failure?
I do not believe so. I mean, I do agree, as I think both your other guests have said, that Khalifa Haftar does have to have a place, and I'm sure will have a place in the future of Libya. However, I do believe that in his role as a military commander, that needs to be under civilian control. Now, I think what has been mentioned about the GNA, yes, it's true, they have had, a year and a half. They haven't had many successes. There are many problems in Libya. Even in Tripoli, they don't have full control of many areas. There's a problem with electricity, water, infrastructure. They haven't done a great job. However, I think it's important to remember also that although they have reached out to Haftar, he has been a major spoiler in efforts to try and unify and to amend the Libyan political agreement. And so far, that process is still stalled. And I think because Haftar has been gaining momentum in the east, and in large part due to the support mentioned there from the UAE and Egypt, among others, this has meant he hasn't actually needed to kind of come to the negotiating table because he's already getting outside backing. So I do believe, although the UN process is far from perfect, the GNA is far from perfect, in order to have a stable Libyan society, one that can move forward, create a constitution and move out of this transitional phase, and that does need to involve all the actors on the table, and that's very difficult to do when you have one faction who is backed militarily by some of the strong regional powers and who do appear to be pushing for a more kind of military victory in western and southern Libya as well as the east.
Right. Mansour, some of these key players on the outside have been involved in the GCC-Qatar spat. I wonder, how does that affect the situation on the ground in Libya, given that Qatar was accused of funding and supporting the extremist groups? You have the UAE and Egypt, for example, supporting Haftar. Is that adding to the complication and the mess?
I think it is. I think the big problem is so many countries with their own agendas are actually meddling in Libyan affairs, as though Libya doesn't have enough to deal with ISIS and extremist groups and illiteracy and thievery, and they have, and so it does. They do not perhaps directly impact, but indirectly they do impact what happens in Libya. And this is what I'm saying. I'm saying Haftar should in fact be smarter in how he deals with these issues. I mean, he has lived outside. He has experienced what the democratic system works like. He has experienced how the world works, and he should know what kind of system he needs to set up in Libya. Sarraj in Tripoli, we give him. You say, give the government in Tripoli a chance to operate. Well, the truth is, it cannot operate within a system of anarchy. Tripoli and the West is under a system of anarchy. It is controlled by militias. You still have remnants of ISIS over there. And they can't, even with the best government in the world, he can't do anything. And yet Sarraj still is clinging to it as though he's the savior of Libya. And he's not. He has no power. And in fact, the antagonism that he created with Haftar has in fact hurt Libya as a whole. This is why when I look at all of this, I see, and your guest from Europe, and both you guys are quite right. That the big problem in Libya is the absence of leadership, and Haftar has proven himself not to be a good leader, because a good leader should not only control power, but he knows how to use it.
Okay.
And he's not using it very well.
Okay. And just before...
This is my bigger problem.
Okay. And just before we end the discussion, I want to talk about Daesh a little bit, because Haftar smashed them in Benghazi along with some other groups. But Rhiannon, you run the web portal Eye on ISIS in Libya. Presumably they're not just going to roll over and die now that they suffered a defeat in Benghazi. How prevalent are they still across the country, and how much of a danger are they and other extremist groups like them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important point to make, that although ISIS, you know, they have lost most of their territory, also many of these other jihadi groups now have also. The first point is that there is a kind of mutability between these different jihadi groups. So just because someone used to fight for ISIS or the Benghazi Revolutionary Shura Council or others, it doesn't mean that they won't swap between them, and therefore there is a lot of exchanging between these groups. Therefore the jihadist threat is not the ISIS threat alone. As you've mentioned, in Benghazi, they've been very weakened. They were already weak, to be honest, in Benghazi. But what we've seen in Sirte since the end of 2016, where the American Mazaratan campaign drove them out of the city, what we've begun to see in the last 2 months is, so some of these fighters did seep south of Sirte to the deserts south of Sirte, sort of north of Jufra. And we have seen in recent months there have been a rise in kind of hijacking of fuel tanks. There have been a few kind of minor scuffles and attacks in that area. So they are weakened, there's no doubt about that, and it's unlikely, I think, that they will be able to regain territory in the same way they had previously. But I think the important point, which is the one I made earlier, is that the ability of these jihadi groups, including ISIS, Ansar Sharia and others, to gain territory and to have the amount of control they've had in the last 3 years is due to the lack of governance and instability in many of these areas. And I think the danger is in somewhere like Sirte, which is effectively in a no man's land between the sort of eastern and western factions, is that if that instability continues, if, for example, there's a new conflict in that area, there will be the opportunity for these groups to regain a bit of control and to be able to launch kind of guerrilla-style attacks. So I don't think we've seen the last of them, and I think the threat will continue to persist.
And just before we end, Mohammed, do you agree with that? These extremist groups are still around and they'll continue to operate within the anarchy?
As long as the environment that gave rise to them and the environment that was conducive to allow them to flourish is there, of course the threat of jihadism and extremist groups will always remain. But I also wanted to stress the point that the jihadist threat in Libya, or the extremist threat in Libya, is not just ISIS, but there are lots of other Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, Boko Haram individuals, some from the Sahel region. Some groups operating in the Sahel region are also active in southern Libya, and these represent a major instability factor and a major threat for the future of Libya. But I think Khalifa Haftar is also capitalizing on this. His forces will be moving on Sirte, for example, to try and capture Sirte over the next few months. His commanders have made this clear, and I think his forces are mobilizing there, and he is portraying himself as the individual and the authority and the force that is capable of having a controlled environment that cannot give rise or cannot be conducive of extremist groups, and that with his security apparatus or with his security approach, he can actually win the battle against these groups. Whether he will be able to or not, that remains to be seen.
What a mess. We hope for all Libyans, they experience better times ahead. But it's been great to talk to all of you. Mohammed, Mansour and Rhiannon, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming up on the program, South Sudan's government says the country's Independence Day is not a time to celebrate. And Qatar signs a new anti-terror deal with the United States. Is this the major break Doha needs over its diplomatic spat with the GCC? Independence Day celebrations tend to be marked with joyous parades and fireworks. That's not the case for South Sudan. Ongoing conflict, famine, and a mass exodus of civilians are the reasons the government says it won't be holding any public ceremonies. About a third of the country's population of 12.5 million have been forced to flee their homes because of the ongoing civil war and deteriorating living conditions. Who's to blame? Well, a new report by Amnesty International says both government forces and rebel militias have been involved in the torture and killing of civilians. And the UN says the country is potentially facing genocide. Well, joining me now from London is Marwan Mortat. He's a South Sudan political commentator and analyst. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. 6 years on, is there anything to celebrate?
Not really. I mean, you've described it very well. The war has affected the country severely. And also, the government has no money, really, to even conduct a small-scale celebration.
If you can pinpoint one moment when it all went wrong immediately after the independence of South Sudan, what was that moment? Because from the outside looking in, it seemed as if it unraveled very quickly.
This was something the South Sudanese were really looking forward to. They fought for 50 years to be free and have their emancipation and set up their country. But yes, looking back now, it looked that it took a while before the problem started. But it was really, it was 2011 we became independent, 2013, just before the second anniversary, South Sudan was already embroiled into war. It was triggered by power struggle right at the top. Mm-hmm. Although people knew that there were pending issues, from the period of struggle, there were cracks among the South Sudanese leadership at the time, but they were able to contain the cracks, the divisions, and the differences until independence. And people thought that they would be able to, manage those differences. Unfortunately, they didn't, and the country exploded in December 2013 into vicious violence. So that was really the moment, the month of November, October, November, leading up to December 2013. That was the period when it all built up and, the country descended into war.
Looking at this latest Amnesty report, in some ways, people would expect rebel forces that are not under kind of central control, many are just kind of random militias. People would expect them to be committing atrocities, but people wouldn't expect government soldiers to be killing civilians, to be raping women. So what does that tell you? Does that tell you that, for example, rape is being used as a weapon of war by the army, or that President Salva Kiir just has little control over his government and his country anymore? Which one is it?
Yes, more the latter than the former. He has command, but the command is limited. We must remember that South Sudan has had a very little time to build any significant infrastructure or institutions, really. The main institution that South Sudan has, really, is the army. Because this army was an army of volunteers who joined the revolution almost now in 1983 to fight for ultimately to fight for the right of South Sudan that led to independence. So that group of volunteers made up the core of the SPLM, which is the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the National Army of South Sudan. And it has really multiple tiers. If you go right to the core and the top of it, it's quite disciplined and organized, but really it's too big. And one of the major aims of the government at the initial periods of independence was to reorganize the army. And of course, the war came too soon, and that never actually came to fruition. So yes, there are huge issues of discipline in the army, but that is also made worse by the fact that the government has made use of allied militias, sort of loosely organized armies, group of armies, militias that are not really disciplined at all, not completely, don't come directly under the umbrella of the government, but they are allied to the government. And most atrocities have been coming from these groups. Mm-hmm.
So do you believe that everybody is currently committing war crimes right now?
Yes, the government will be culpable, will be responsible by default, because they are the ones ruling the country. They are the one commanding the army.
Yeah.
From their point of view, they're saying they're trying their very best. They're trying their best to control the army, but of course, ultimately, the responsibility is theirs. Yeah. But there isn't a design plan by the government to commit these things.
Yeah, for the moment, their best is not good enough.
Not strong enough.
I want to draw your attention to something President Salva Kiir said very recently, and then I want to get your comment off the back of it. Let's have a little listen for a moment.
I declared a unilateral ceasefire and general amnesty. I'm encouraged that the general security situation in the country has now improved. The ambushes and skirmishes that were daily occurrences have substantially diminished.
So he was talking about the declaration of the unilateral ceasefire, and he said the situation was generally stable. That's when I guess he felt he had the complete momentum over Riek Machar and any other rebels. Was he wrong? Was he naive to declare that unilateral ceasefire, given that the humanitarian crisis only seems to be getting worse and the fighting continues?
To be fair to the government, the statements of the president are right. I mean, he gave those statements barely a week ago in his speech for independence, and that's true. The violence has significantly subsided, but there isn't much to celebrate, because, as you say, a third of the country are living away from their homes. They are displaced either internally, living inside United Nations, refugee camps, and many of them, more than half of them, as well, living abroad, both in Sudan and other neighboring countries, Uganda and Kenya. And that is nothing to be proud of. Yes, in terms of the direct threat, army threat, military threat to the government, that has subsided. But the country has shrunk, the economy has shrunk significantly in the last few years. Maybe the economy has shrunk by 30–35% of what it was in 2011. That is a severe problem, and it's being felt by people that we know in the country. So there are huge issues. But yes, the violence, the direct violence, has subsided, and the government has had an upper hand.
Yeah.
Marwan,
the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has a plan to merge all or parts of the U.S. Agency for International Development into the State Department. There's talk of cuts to USAID and to the general aid to Africa as a whole, but South Sudan in particular. Now, the U.S. was big on South Sudanese independence. We saw it with President Barack Obama. We even saw it preceding him with President George W. Bush. The U.S. was a major funder and supporter of the South Sudanese independence movement. And then when you became a new country, they supported you and backed you. How devastating would it be if the U.S. decides not to give the little bit that it is giving right now?
Well, hugely devastating. Hugely devastating. But South Sudan was recognized as a middle-income country. In fact, if South Sudan did not have a potential to survive economically, maybe the international community might not have recognized it as an independent country. So that's a crucial issue. But that mainly is dependence on oil, and oil prices, to say the least, are way below what they used to be. And that's partly one of the problems in South Sudan. So it is going to hit South Sudan. But there are people in South Sudan, commentators, thinkers, people of opinion in South Sudan, who would say this might actually be a good thing, because the history of aid in South Sudan in the last 50 years, especially the years of the war, where the South Sudanese subsistence farmers were, continued to be displaced and were incapable of producing enough food in the traditional manner, that period has created an environment of dependency. And maybe if aid is squeezed a little bit, that might actually nudge the South Sudanese communities to become self-reliant.
Understandable. That's long-term, right? Sure, certainly. Sorry to interrupt you, but okay, that's long-term.
Correct.
Right? You want people to be self-sufficient.
Yes.
But at the moment, 6 million people
Yes.
of your country are reliant on food aid. There's famine, there's cholera. Are you really telling me that it might be a silver lining that international aid might not be coming in? People are starving to death.
We know that the change of administration in America brought this, and it's not only South Sudan that's going to be affected by this. America is realigning its foreign policy. So it's going to devastate South Sudan. But also another thing in the immediate term, one thing that could come out of this is at the moment the South Sudanese are looking at a homegrown solution. And they are talking about perhaps the government is having this initiative, what they call the national dialogue. And maybe when people look behind them and see that, aid money is not going to become, their pockets are not going to be lined, they're not going to be taken to expensive hotels around the world to negotiate, that might actually nudge the leaders to maybe seek solutions.
That's
and if there are
point.
political solutions, that would force them to address the issues.
Yeah, fair point, fair point. Marwan Murtad, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
The memorandum lays out a series of steps the two countries will take over the coming months and years to interrupt and disable terror financing flows and intensify counterterrorism activities globally. The agreement includes milestones to ensure both countries are accountable to their commitments. Together, the United States and Qatar will do more to track down funding sources, will do more to collaborate and share information, and will do more to keep the region and our homeland safe.
The US and Qatar are on a roller coaster of a relationship. At one moment, the US president is in Riyadh telling the GCC that Qatar is a sponsor of terror. And in the next instance, the US Secretary of State is in Doha saying the two countries have signed a new pact to fight terrorism. As we just heard Rex Tillerson say, the agreement aims to share resources in the fight against extremists. But Saudi Arabia says the deal is not enough to end an air and sea blockade of Qatar, demanding that the Qatari emir does everything from stop funding Hamas to hitting the off switch on news broadcaster Al Jazeera. Well, joining me now from Jeddah is Salman Al-Ansari. He's a writer, political commentator, and the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. And in Geneva, Jean-Marc Rickley. He's the director of global risk at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Jean-Marc, let me begin with you. Is this the beginning of the end of the crisis, given that Tillerson went to Doha and signed that deal with the Qataris?
Well, I think it's a good start because, frankly, I think the only country that can try to open ways for de-escalation are the United States. And so the fact that the US now is on board and is involved is a good sign. I think that the resolution of the crisis will be very long because the demands are put on Qatar are very extensive, comprehensive, and do not leave Qatar with much room of exit strategy. So there will be probably a lot of back and forth negotiation between the two camps to get to a resolution, if a resolution is actually possible.
Okay, Salman, in hindsight, given that the US Secretary of State said the Qataris are being reasonable, in hindsight, did the Saudi-led coalition ask for too much in those initial demands?
Thanks, Imran, and hi to all the viewers of TRT World around the globe. I don't really think that the GCC or Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Egypt and United Arab Emirates asked for so much. Why? Because in the Riyadh Accord of 2013 and 2014, they basically asked for almost the same things, just like two new points that have been added. So Tamim, the Emir of Qatar, has personally signed the Riyadh Accord, but unfortunately none of the things mentioned there have been followed by the Qataris. So I think definitely I see the American partnership with the GCC is very important, and the visit of Tillerson is very, very important. And I can see that there is like a genuine interest in the US administration to basically do something to de-escalate the situation, etc.
But Salman,
and it's also good that they pressured the Qataris to. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so here we have it, right? We have Tillerson.
I think it's also good that they pressured the Qataris to do something.
Sure. Yeah, the Qataris haven't come out and said, we're sorry. Tillerson didn't come out and say, the Qataris told me that they're going to meet the Saudis halfway. None of that came out. The Qataris seem to be doubling down on their position, and Tillerson is saying their position is okay. So with all of that in mind, the only side that seems to need to do the walk back is the Saudi-led coalition.
Yeah, I don't think it's this way. It might seem so by having like Tillerson's kind of a style on his statements, etc. But you can tell that the U.S. administration is trying to create some sort of a balance. I think the U.S. has already been very effective and also have been very serious about addressing the Qataris issues. So the fact that President Trump, when he talked about Qatar being a sponsor and funder of terrorism at a very high level, didn't come just like a random kind of speech. No, it's in the strategic interest of the United States to get Qatar back on track and to not allow Qatar to basically support the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, or support Hamas, or support Fajr Libya militia in Libya, or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is JFS right now it's called, which is Al-Qaeda affiliated group. So there are a lot going on, and it's very complex, and the relationship that Qatar has had with non-state actors is very concerning and very alarming to everybody, including the United States as an ally for all the GCC members. So I think the United States is going to put enough pressure on the Qataris, but it's a way to save their face by not having a flashy, strong kind of statements in public. But I'm pretty sure that the Americans are actually very serious of getting Qatar to be back on track and to not have Qatar to be supporting non-state actors. We know that Qatar in the past used to be having this kind of strategy of being or trying to be the mediator between non-state actors and world powers, specifically the United States. But the issue is that they took a step further, and they did not only work on mediation and being a broker, but they took a step further by being a sponsor, by being a funder of some non-state actors. That's very alarming.
No, fair enough. But you know, when I spoke to the Qatari ambassador to Australia, he told me, I said, you know, was it worth it for you guys to have Hamas in Doha? Was it worth it for you to have the Muslim Brotherhood? When all is said and done, this is the reason these guys are hammering you. This is the reason there's a blockade, because there's a connection with them. He said this is disingenuous because from the United States and everybody else, they used us as a conduit. They supported us. They said, we want you guys to be the ones who give Hamas a place in Doha. We want you guys to be the ones with a channel to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now suddenly they've turned on us and said they want to punish us for it. You would understand that, wouldn't you, Salman?
Yeah, I got your point. It's actually very tricky here. Why? Because you can be a mediator as long as there is a green light from world powers. That's true. But what you can do is to use that mediation to basically harm other U.S. allies in the region. That is that's considered to be some sort of like a red line, not only for the United States, but for the global community, because you cannot basically be a mediator with non-state actors while you are having those non-state actors to be affecting the security and the national security of the United States allies in the region, specifically the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or Egypt or United Arab Emirates or the Kingdom of Bahrain. So I think it's very important right now to make it very clear, specifically if we go back to the Riyadh summit, and it's made it very clear that there would be almost zero tolerance to terrorism and terrorism funders and terrorism advocates. And also there is something else when it comes to Al Jazeera channel and the media engine of Qatar. It's very important to make them and pressure them to basically not spread hatred, to not spread or advocate for terrorism or non-state actors, because that is very
okay,
dangerous.
and those are in the conditions, undoubtedly.
It can jeopardize the overall process of combating terrorism.
Okay, yeah, and I don't want to go into an in-depth discussion of Al Jazeera, because we've done that in the past, but those are the requirements, those are the conditions. Jean-Marc, is there a point, does Salman make a point that there was a Riyadh summit, there were these Riyadh agreements from 2013 and 2014. Al Arabiya has released the actual text of the documents now. They say it has the signature of Sheikh Tamim Al-Thani. The Emir agreed to all of these things, but he had 3 years to do something about it, and he didn't. Does Salman and the Saudis, do they have a point that the Qataris promised to do something, but they did nothing?
Well, I think just first to answer, to comment on the previous question regarding the role of Qatar. And I think you pointed something out which is key in international relations, is that small states, which is the case of Qatar, have to invest in niche strategies. And Qatar has invested in negotiation and mediation. And it is true that similar to what the Swiss did, for instance, during the Cold War, where they were a go-between between the two camps, Qatar, for a very long time, played a role in mediating between different groups. It is true also that after the Arab Spring, Qatar played a very active role in supporting certain movements, especially, for instance, in Libya, and that antagonized its neighbor. So at the time, maybe Qatar went too far because it conducted a policy that could not be in agreement with the size of the countries. I think that since 2013 and 14, the foreign policy of Qatar has dramatically shifted. I mean, the main focus is no longer on foreign policy. It's rather on reform, domestic reform, and economic development in Qatar. So on both sides, there is some kind of irony, because what one side is telling the other should have not done, that side did it in the past. You could make the similar argument when it comes, for instance, to 9/11. You take the 9/11 report regarding the terrorists. 15, it's not me saying that, it's even Trump saying that during its presidential campaign, that 15 of the 19 terrorists were from Saudi Arabia, the rest from Lebanon, UAE, and Egypt, the countries that are now telling Qatar that it's supporting terrorism. So I think what should come out of this crisis, which should be very beneficial to international security, is more clarity and transparency when it comes to support, official and sometimes unofficial support to a specific group. Okay. And in that case, I think that both sides have to make some move on that.
Okay, so Salman, the same arguments that you have for Qatar, people can look at the 28 pages of the 9/11 report and show that there was Saudi money that eventually reached the hijackers of those planes on 9/11, and people can say, well, Saudi Arabia sponsors terrorism. Everybody can play this game, is what Jean-Marc is saying.
Yeah, I think the idea of the horrendous incident of 9/11 is a completely different topic. But actually, with that regard, even Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 horrendous terrorist attack, was actually living in Qatar itself. And it never been mentioned in the mainstream media, but the intelligence communities knew that. And he actually was plotting to attack Manila, and he was plotting to attack different places in the world.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed living in Qatar versus 15 of the 19 being Saudis is a big difference, right? I mean, again, you're making my point for me. Everybody can play this game, and in response to that, you're playing the game again.
No, it's not about playing the game or not, because when it comes to the 9/11 commission report, 472 pages, it said that there's no actual proof of Saudi involvement. When it comes to the 28 pages that you've mentioned, it has the same thing. It doesn't say that there is any proof or direct proof that there is an engagement from the Saudi government. When it comes to the congressional report of 838 pages, it said the same thing. So it's a completely different case. But we're not here, Imran, to speak about like playing the game of like blaming or pointing finger who's supporting terrorism and who's not. No, what we are trying to do is to basically have a comprehensive work to eradicate terrorism and its causes from the roots. And the root is basically hatred, spreading hatred, advocacy for non-state actors, advocacy for the Muslim Brotherhood, because we all know that even the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he himself said that al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, who we hope that he got killed, was saying that al-Baghdadi was actually part of the Muslim Brotherhood group. It's the same thing with al-Zawahiri. So it's very tricky here. We need to really be very decisive on pointing the fingers at the groups that advocate for what is so-called like the Khilafat, or what's so-called the Islamic nation that needs to be under one leadership, etc.
Sure. No, that's a good point. Understandably. And I'd love to have another conversation on this, because we could go back even further, because there's a strong argument to say that the type of Islam that is state-sanctioned by Saudi Arabia, of the Wahhabi variety, might be one of the root causes. But that's going to be another program, and I'll invite you on for that one, because that will be an interesting discussion, because how far back do you go when you look at root causes? Looking forward to that. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. Salman Al-Ansari and Jean-Marc Rickley, good to talk to both of you. Let's see if Qatar has been able to weather the storm. Looking forward to chatting to both of you again. Thanks so much. Next time on the Newsmakers, we investigate who was responsible for Turkey's failed coup and ask if the government's response is justified. Until then, I'm Muamar Gadhafi. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.